The radiation meter showed 15,000 roentgen, a lethal dose. But the Soviet government was telling people, everything is safe. Nuclear engineer Valery Legasov knew the truth. Millions would die, and the government was lying. Chernobyl, the man who died for telling the truth. Welcome to Classified Hidden Histories, where we uncover the secrets they never wanted you to know. I'm your host, and today we're diving into the story of the scientist who tried to save Europe from nuclear catastrophe and was silenced by his own government April 26, 1986. 1:23 a.m. The phone rang in Valery Legasov's Moscow apartment, pulling him from sleep. At 49 years old, Legasov was one of the Soviet Union's most respected nuclear physicists, the first deputy director of the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy. Late-night calls usually meant important government business, but something about this one felt different. The voice on the phone was terse, official. There had been an accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine. The deputy minister needed Legasov at the Kremlin immediately for an emergency commission meeting. Details were scarce, but the minister's tone suggested this was serious. Legasov dressed quickly, his mind already running through possibilities. Nuclear accidents ranged from minor equipment failures to catastrophic core meltdowns. The fact that they were convening an emergency commission at 2 a.m. suggested something on the severe end of that spectrum. At the Kremlin, Legasov found chaos. Ministers, scientists, and military officials crowded into conference rooms, reviewing incomplete reports from Chernobyl. The information was contradictory and confusing. The plant's director claimed the reactor core was intact. Local officials reported fires but insisted radiation levels were acceptable. None of it made sense. Legasov knew nuclear reactors. He understood the RBMK design used at Chernobyl, its strengths and its dangerous flaws. If the core had been compromised, radiation would be spreading across Ukraine and beyond. But if officials were saying everything was under control, perhaps this was a minor incident being handled with typical Soviet overcaution. By dawn, the commission had decided to send a team to Chernobyl to assess the situation. Legasov volunteered to go, partly out of professional duty and partly out of growing suspicion that the initial reports were hiding something terrible. Legasov's helicopter approached Chernobyl just after noon on April 26th, about 12 hours after the explosion. As they flew over the power plant, Legasov felt his stomach drop. The roof of Reactor 4 was gone, completely destroyed. A pillar of smoke rose from the exposed core, carrying radioactive particles into the atmosphere. This wasn't a minor accident. This was a complete reactor meltdown, the worst nuclear disaster in human history, unfolding in real time. The helicopter landed at a makeshift command center several kilometers from the plant. Legasov immediately asked for radiation measurements. The readings made his blood run cold, 15,000 roentgen per hour near the reactor. A dose of just 400 roentgen was fatal. Workers near the reactor core were receiving lethal doses in seconds. But when Legasov tried to brief local officials on the severity of the situation, he encountered resistance. Plant administrators insisted the core was intact, that radiation levels were elevated but manageable. They seemed more concerned with avoiding blame than addressing the catastrophe. Legasov realized with growing horror that Soviet officials were lying about the disaster, out of ignorance, denial, or deliberate cover-up. The radiation spreading from Chernobyl would contaminate vast areas of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. Depending on wind patterns, it could reach Western Europe. Millions of people needed to be evacuated immediately, but local officials were telling residents everything was fine. He watched as firemen continued fighting the blaze without proper protection, receiving lethal radiation doses while trying to contain fires that couldn't be extinguished with water. He saw workers walking near the reactor without dosimeters, completely unaware they were being poisoned. He observed officials more worried about political consequences than human lives. That evening, Legasov tried to convince the commission to recommend immediate evacuation of Pripyat, the city of 50,000 people located just 3 kilometers from the plant. But political officials resisted. Evacuation would create panic, they argued. It would make the Soviet Union look weak and incompetent. Better to downplay the severity and maintain order. Legasov couldn't believe what he was hearing. The radiation exposure in Pripyat was already dangerous. Children were playing outside, breathing radioactive air. Families were going about their normal routines, completely unaware they were being poisoned. Every hour of delay meant more people receiving potentially fatal doses. Legasov spent the next 36 hours fighting Soviet bureaucracy to save lives. He presented radiation measurements, medical projections, worst-case scenarios. He explained that the exposed reactor core was continuing to emit massive amounts of radiation that would spread across Europe if not contained. Finally, on April 27th, more than 36 hours after the explosion, Soviet authorities agreed to evacuate Pripyat. But even this evacuation was handled with typical Soviet opacity. Residents were told it was temporary, that they'd be back in a few days. They left their apartments with minimal belongings, not knowing they'd never return. Legasov watched the evacuation with mixed emotions. Relief that people were finally being moved to safety, but rage that it had taken so long. Rage that officials had lied to residents, telling them everything was safe while radiation poisoned their children. Rage that the Soviet system valued political image over human life. But the immediate crisis was far from over. The reactor core was still exposed, still burning, still releasing radiation into the atmosphere. Unless they could contain it, the disaster would continue spreading. Scientists estimated that if the core melted through the reactor floor into the water reservoirs below, a catastrophic steam explosion could destroy the other 3 reactors and contaminate half of Europe. Legasov helped coordinate a desperate effort to prevent this nightmare scenario. Miners were brought in to dig a tunnel under the reactor to install a cooling system. Helicopter pilots flew directly over the exposed core, dropping sand and boron to smother the reaction, receiving lethal radiation doses in the process. Thousands of liquidators, soldiers, workers, and volunteers were sent into highly radioactive areas to clean up debris and construct a concrete sarcophagus over the destroyed reactor. Each of these operations required sending people into radiation levels that guaranteed illness and likely death. Legasov had to calculate the acceptable exposure levels, knowing that acceptable still meant many would die within months or years from radiation-induced cancers and organ failure. While Soviet officials were still trying to downplay Chernobyl domestically, international detection systems were revealing the truth. Radiation monitoring stations in Sweden, Finland, and Poland detected massive spikes in atmospheric radioactivity. By April 28th, Western scientists had calculated that a major nuclear accident had occurred in the Soviet Union. International pressure forced the Kremlin to acknowledge the disaster, but their public statements continued to minimize its severity. They claimed the situation was under control, that radiation levels posed no threat to public health, that Western concerns were exaggerated. Legasov knew this was dangerously false. The radiation cloud from Chernobyl was spreading across Europe, contaminating farmland, water supplies, and air. People across multiple countries were being exposed without their knowledge because Soviet officials refused to admit the scope of the catastrophe. The scientific community needed accurate information to assess risk and take protective measures. But providing that information would mean contradicting official Soviet statements, which was essentially treason. Legasov faced an impossible choice: remain silent and complicit in an international cover-up, or speak truth and face severe consequences. In early May, Legasov was selected to represent the Soviet Union at an International Atomic Energy Agency meeting in Vienna, where he would brief international scientists on Chernobyl. Soviet officials gave him clear instructions: acknowledge the accident, but emphasize it was caused by operator error, downplay radiation releases, and assure the international community that everything was under control. Legasov spent sleepless nights preparing his presentation, torn between loyalty to his country and responsibility to scientific truth. The data he'd collected at Chernobyl told a story of systemic failures, design flaws in Soviet reactors, and catastrophic mismanagement. But telling that truth would humiliate the Soviet Union and likely destroy his career. On August 25, 1986, Valery Legasov stood before hundreds of international nuclear scientists in Vienna. Every word he spoke would be scrutinized by Western experts who would compare his testimony against their own radiation measurements and satellite imagery. He couldn't lie successfully even if he wanted to. The evidence of Chernobyl's severity was undeniable. Legasov made his choice. He told the truth. He described the explosion in technical detail, explaining how a poorly designed safety test had triggered a power surge that destroyed the reactor. He acknowledged that Soviet reactor designs had fundamental flaws that contributed to the disaster. He provided accurate measurements of radiation releases and admitted they were far higher than initially reported. Most importantly, Legasov broke from official Soviet narrative by acknowledging systemic failures rather than blaming everything on operator error. He described how poor safety culture, inadequate training, and political pressure to meet production targets had created conditions for catastrophe. The international scientific community was stunned. A senior Soviet official was admitting to design flaws and systemic failures that his government had spent months trying to hide. Legasov's testimony represented an unprecedented breach of Soviet secrecy and dishonesty. Back in Moscow, KGB officials watched Legasov's Vienna testimony with growing fury. He had embarrassed the Soviet Union on the international stage, admitted to flaws in Soviet technology, and undermined years of propaganda about Soviet scientific superiority. This was unacceptable. Within days of returning from Vienna, Legasov's life began to change. He was denied promotions he'd been promised. Colleagues who had been friendly became distant. He was excluded from important meetings and research projects. The message was clear. Speak truth about Chernobyl. Face consequences. Over the following 2 years, Legasov continued fighting for nuclear safety reforms and honest assessment of Chernobyl's impact. He wrote reports documenting design flaws in Soviet reactors and recommending changes to prevent future disasters. He argued that the Soviet Union needed to fundamentally reform how it approached nuclear safety, prioritizing human welfare over political image. But Soviet officials had no interest in Legasov's recommendations. Implementing his suggested reforms would require admitting that Soviet technology was flawed, that previous assurances of reactor safety had been lies, that Chernobyl was preventable if proper safety culture had existed. Legasov became increasingly isolated and depressed. His health deteriorated from radiation exposure at Chernobyl. He suffered from chronic illness, knew he was dying slowly from radiation-induced damage. But worse than physical illness was psychological burden of knowing that his efforts to reform nuclear safety were being ignored. On April 26, 1988, exactly 2 years after the Chernobyl explosion, Valery Legasov died by suicide in his Moscow apartment. He left behind audio recordings describing the true causes of the Chernobyl disaster, documenting the lies Soviet officials had told, and explaining why his reform efforts had failed. These recordings remained secret for years, but they eventually became public after the Soviet Union collapsed. Legasov's testimony revealed the full extent of governmental deception about Chernobyl and documented how political priorities had overridden safety concerns at every level. Valery Legasov's death at 51 was ruled a suicide, but many believe the KGB was involved. Whether he took his own life in despair or was murdered to silence him permanently, the result was the same. The man who tried to tell the truth about Chernobyl was dead. The official Soviet death toll from Chernobyl was 31, mostly firemen and plant workers who received acute radiation poisoning. But this number is grotesquely understated. Independent estimates suggest thousands died from acute radiation sickness, while tens of thousands more developed fatal cancers from radiation exposure. The true toll extends far beyond immediate deaths. The area surrounding Chernobyl remains contaminated and uninhabitable. Millions of people across Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia live in regions with elevated radiation levels. Cancer rates in affected areas remain abnormally high decades later. Legasov's attempts to reform Soviet nuclear safety were largely unsuccessful during his lifetime, but his testimony helped the international community understand what had gone wrong at Chernobyl. His willingness to speak truth despite personal cost provided crucial lessons about the dangers of prioritizing political image over safety. The Chernobyl disaster revealed the catastrophic consequences of government lies. Soviet officials' refusal to admit the severity of the accident, their delay in evacuating residents, their cover-up of radiation releases, all of these decisions resulted in unnecessary deaths and suffering. Legasov understood that transparency and honesty were essential for nuclear safety. Accidents will happen, but their consequences are vastly worse when governments lie about them. His testimony in Vienna was an act of extraordinary courage, choosing scientific truth over political loyalty at tremendous personal cost. The next time you hear government officials downplaying a crisis or assuring you that everything is under control, remember Valery Legasov. Remember that in Pripyat, officials told residents everything was safe while radiation poisoned their children. Remember that sometimes the truth is worth dying for. This is Classified Hidden Histories, where we uncover the secrets they never wanted you to know. Because understanding how governments lie in times of crisis helps us demand transparency when it matters most. Valery Legasov's audio recordings are preserved in Russian archives, a testament to one man's determination that truth about Chernobyl would eventually emerge. His sacrifice helped ensure that the world learned what really happened when Soviet nuclear technology and Soviet dishonesty combined to create history's worst nuclear disaster. In the end, Legasov's story is about the price of truth in a system built on lies. He tried to save millions through honest assessment and transparent communication. The Soviet system destroyed him for it, but his testimony survived to expose the lies that made Chernobyl's catastrophe far worse than it needed to be.